Hi guys, in this Explain Everything, I'm going to be going through all of the sections that you need to know in regards to the EPI poster, making sure that I'm giving you all of the tips and tricks to ensure that you have the opportunity to get 100% on this task. So just remember that this is the third and final task of the whole EPI assignment. So obviously you've had the proposal task that you did in term 2, you have the analysis task that you did late term 2, and then of course you have the scientific poster. When I send through the link to this poster, or this Explain Everything on YouTube, I will also be sending you your EPI booklet. I will be sending you the electronic template so you can do your poster. I'll be sending you a sample as well as your past research. Now, it's really important that you are using all of these resources to help you so you can achieve that 30 out of 30. What I'm assuming, or what I'm going to be doing, is when I'm looking at your poster, I'm assuming that everybody has 30 marks. And so it's really up to you that you keep your mark at 30 out of 30. Now just remember that this isn't a very hard task, but there is quite a lot of detail that you need to consider. And if you are missing out on the detail, for example, a title or labeling an axes, not putting in your appendices, then you will very, very fast, or you very quickly, I should say, lose a lot of marks. Now remember, because this is the highest weighting of your EPI mark, it does contribute quite a lot to that overall mark, which is going to be for your Unit 4 coursework. So there is a lot of stuff that you do need to consider. So I would recommend that you do this and take your time with it. And then when you come back from the holidays, you can ask me any questions that you want. And then, of course, you can submit it in that first week. Now, also, I want you to consider that when we get back from holidays, that very first lesson, I'm going to be giving you feedback on your other 2 tasks. So we're going to go through those SACs, go through the mark scheme, and talk about those kinds of things in relation to this poster. So make sure your poster's done. Do it next week, the last week of the holidays, and then come in, we will go through all the other stuff, the feedback, and then you can use that feedback to finalize and really make sure that your poster is up to scratch. Now remember, for my Keysborough boys, your poster is going to be due on the Thursday because I'll see you on the Tuesday to give you feedback. My Berwick class, you are going to be giving me your posters on the Friday because I see you on the Wednesday. Okay, so Keys class, yours is due on Thursday. Berwick class, yours is due on Friday. When you give me your poster, remember, I want 3 things. I want your EPI booklet fully planned out, fully written out. I want your poster, and I want that printed. I'm not printing it for you. I don't want it electronically. I want you to print it for me. And I want your appendices, which I'll talk about a little bit later. Okay, so the first thing that we're going to start looking at is the title and the introduction of the poster. Now, I did not mention in the previous slide that I'll also be sending you this PowerPoint as well. So the title is just really going to be the effect of the IV on the DV. So that's going to be the simple IV on the simple DV. So for example, your title might be the effect of state-dependent cues on memory retrieval, or context-dependent cues on memory retrieval. So it's going to be a statement, not a question. And of course, remember, we're using simple variables rather than operationalized. So the big thing, the first big section that we are looking at is the introduction. So the introduction is an overview of the purpose of the investigation, and so why the audience, i.e. me, is interested in this investigation. So what we're doing with the past research and the background theory is we're putting our experiment in context. So, why it's of interest, why I would want to know about this. The first thing that you need to consider in terms of the structure of your introduction is that it should be like a funnel. So, if you have a look at the sample, you can see that it starts really general up here. So just a really general statement about alcohol and what it does to your body. And then what actually happens is the information gets much more specific through the past research and then eventually through the objectives. So going really general, what's this all about? What's the background theory saying? What is an experiment that has been done that we've looked at? What is our experiment? So in going general to specific. So what I would suggest you do is you start off really general and you give a statement or something along the lines of a sentence about the nature of cues, for example. Then you would go into your key definitions of the topic, and then it needs to get more and more specific. Now just remember, you need to give 2 or 3 definitions within the introduction. So you definitely should be giving whatever your IV is. So in our case, it's going to be either state or context dependent cues. So you need to define that. And you also need to define what the DV is going to be. So in our case, it's going to be memory retrieval. Now, you aren't just going to give me 2 definitions, okay? If you have a look at this paragraph here, you can see it's just not one definition after another. They actually link. So what we're looking at is how is the IV affecting the DV? So holistically, in terms of your background theory, what you should start off with is discussion about retrieval cues and maybe how they help us to retrieve information. So like, for example, if we encode information and then it's similar when we retrieve it, obviously that retrieval cue is going to be helpful for us. Then what I would suggest you do is link it to CDCs or SDCs, context or state dependent cues, as an example of a retrieval cue. Define that term and retrieval, and then discuss how context or state dependent cues help us to retrieve information, okay? So it really should be like a 4-point paragraph. So what is your general statement about retrieval cues? Context or state dependent cues are an example of these cues that help us retrieve information. What are they? Define them. Define retrieval. How does one affect the other? One thing that you can see in this first paragraph, and I know I'm talking about this a lot, but it is important, is this highlighted part here. Let's highlight that. Now, that is called in-text referencing, okay? So you need to make sure that you're using it. So essentially what we're looking at here, or what you're going to be doing, is you're going to be referencing where you got your definitions from. Now, we are just using Grievous, so you can actually use this same reference. You only need to reference once. So after the first definition you give, I would assume it's going to be context-dependent cues. Just chuck that in there. Actually, you know what? Scratch that. For both definitions, just put in Grievous 217 in brackets after each definition. Okay, and I'll write that for you. So, after each definition that you give, I want you in brackets to put Grievous 217 as a reference to where you found the information, because that's where I go for my information. So let's go down to that second part. Now that second part is just a summary of your past research. Now, of course, this is also highlighted because you need to indicate where you got the information from. So you need to make sure that you're using the name of the researcher and the year that they published their research. Now that will be in the document that I've given you for that past research that we've used over and over again. Now, with the summary of the past research, it needs to be brief, okay? You only have so many words to use, or you do have a word limit, so you need to make sure that you're only looking at the purpose or the aim, the results, and the conclusion. You might also consider, if you have room, a very brief sentence on the procedure, like what they did. But that is not necessary. So I just want the aim, the results, and the conclusion. Now the objectives are the last little part of that funnel that I was talking about. So right at the top, you have your background theories. In the middle, you have your past research. And in the objectives, you have the information about our research. So this section is outlining what we are planning to investigate, how we are manipulating and measuring our variables, and what we predict our outcome to be. It's really easy to write, but you need to make sure your structure is correct. All it will include is the aim. So we're just looking at the effect of this simple IV on the DV. Hint, it's exactly the same as your title is going to be. The research hypothesis. Now, of course, this will include your population, not your sample, the population, the broader one. And I think for all of us, we chose VCE psychology, or VCE students, I think, or even VCE students at Haileybury. We need to include the simple and the operationalised IV and DV, although I think it's kind of double handling, but just do it anyway. And remember that operationalised IV and DV need to be in brackets. And of course, prediction. Then after that, we have the operationalised IV and the operationalised DV. Now, what I would suggest you do is in your group chat, you make sure you have the elements of this properly. That hypothesis and that operationalized IV is actually pretty tricky, so you need to make sure you're getting it properly, otherwise you're going to lose a fair few marks. And I'll talk about it in a minute. Let me just go back and say, in terms of your structure for your objectives, as you can see here, it flows. So what it is not doing is using dot points. Now, you don't have to work very hard to actually connect to the sentences. You literally just need to say, similar to the sample, the aim of this study was, the hypothesis in this study was, the operationalized IV was, the operationalized DV was, okay? So if you don't know how to structure it, just look at these parts here, okay? The aim of this study was, it was hypothesized, the operationalized IV was, the operationalized DV was. Now let's go back and talk about the research hypothesis and the operationalized IV and DV a little bit more. Now I know I've already said this, but you need to make sure it is perfect because one, it's tricky, and two, if it's not perfect, you're going to lose quite a few marks for the hypothesis and the operationalized IV and DV. Now remember, with your hypothesis, I would start off with the simple version first and then pop in the operationalized variables in brackets. That's just going to make your life a little bit easier. Remember, with your hypothesis, it is really tricky. So we know our population is VCE students, and I want you to remember that we are looking at people who recalled information in the same environment as when the information was encoded. So remember, recall and encoding in the same environment as compared to recall and encoding in a different environment. Now with the other class, we're looking at recalling information in the same state as the information was encoded as compared to recalling information in a different state as the information was encoded, okay? So you have to talk about recall and encoding in both conditions. And that's just for the simplified part. Now remember, in terms of our simplified DV, we're looking at increased retrieval. For our operationalized variables, of course, we have to be much more specific. So in terms of context dependent cues, remember, we had people learn a list of words while smelling lavender and then recalling that same list of words when smelling lavender for one condition. In the other condition, they learned a list of words while smelling the lavender, but then they recalled the list of words with no lavender. With the other class, we're talking about whether they had Coke or they ingested Coke in both encoding and recall parts, or if they had Coke when they encoded information but not when they recalled it. So they are our operationalized variables, IV that is. So, sorry, I know I keep going on about this, but it's really important. Just make sure that your simplified IV is right, encoding and recall for both. And then for your operationalized versions, you're talking about what we actually did. So if we gave them lavender or if we gave them Coke. With our operationalized DV, it's a little bit more easy because obviously we're just looking at about the mean number of words correctly recalled in a list of 20. Don't forget we're looking at a mean number. We're looking at the words that were correctly recalled. We had a word list of 20, so chuck that in there. Okay, so the next section is the method. Now, this is a section that I would actually encourage you to do first, because when you're talking about the method, you're talking about what we actually did, who our participants were, what our materials were, and that will really give you a good context to talk about the discussion and then the introduction. So I wouldn't actually necessarily start with the introduction, then go on to the objectives and the method. I would actually start with the method, go to the objectives, then talk about your discussion and then your introduction. So the method is obviously what we actually did. You need to make sure that you are being detailed. So you need to be so detailed that if I wanted to replicate this experiment, I could using a procedure, but it needs to be concise because remember, you've only got so many words. This is the only section where I'm going to let you have subheadings. So in this section, we of course can have a subheading for participants, materials, and procedures. For your materials and your procedure, you can use dot points. With your participants, that has to flow. And with your materials, although you can use dot points, you actually don't have that much room. So I would recommend you just follow this structure that I've given you. So let's start talking about your participants. So you need to make sure that you're providing as much detail as you can. So I'm looking for the total number of participants and the sample, so who the sample was. So for example, my Berwick class, I think we used VCE students at Haileybury Berwick. Keysborough boys, I think we used 1-2 psychology students at Keysborough. So be as specific as you can. Make sure you're giving me the total number, the sample, the age range, and the division or the number of males and females. You also should tell me what sampling method we used. Now, I don't want you to go any further than to identify, and of course we use a convenience sample. So don't explain what it is, don't tell me the pros and cons, just say convenience sampling was used. In terms of our materials, you need to make sure you're listing everything that we used, even something as simple as in a pen and paper. For a lot of you included the key things like Coke, cups, lavender tissues, but a lot of you didn't include things like the projector that was used or the computer. So make sure you're listing literally everything that you've used. The other thing that you need to be cognizant of in this section is your appendices. Now, remember that the purpose of this poster is if I wanted to replicate your experiment, I could do so. Now, what that means is you have to include the specific tests or the word list or whatever that you used in your experiment. So as an appendices or as an attachment, you actually need to provide me with a copy of the 2 word lists that you guys used. Now, the way you do that is just chuck them on a separate piece of paper, and for each of the word lists, and there were 2, you would just write like appendix A, word list 1, like we can see here. And then for the second word list, appendix B, word list 2. You will also have a third appendix, and that will be for your raw data. That will be appendix C, raw data. So when you hand in the poster, you are just going to staple together your poster with the 2 or the 3 appendices. So you need to make sure you're giving me that or you lose 2 marks. You also need to reference that you have an appendix or appendices in your material section. So for example, when you list word list 1, word list 2, you have to then say Appendix A, Appendix B. Make sure that you are doing that, and I'll remind you on the Tuesday or Wednesday when I see you. With your procedure, again, this needs to be as detailed as you can make it, but it also needs to be concise. You need to refer to what you did, and it has to be clear cut. The first thing you need to do is you need to reference the experimental design used, and of course we use an independent groups design. If we used allocation, and now for both our experiments, I believe we didn't, because we did it based on classes. So you could say participants were allocated into an independent groups design based on the class that they were in. So you need to make sure that you're saying that we didn't use random allocation and we used independent groups design. What you need to ensure is that you are telling me exactly what each condition or what each group did. So you need to tell me what the experimental group did. And this is where you would put in like all of those really small details, like how long we gave them to learn the word list, how long we gave them to retrieve the information, how many words were in the list. So in the procedure, you need to include all of the like operationalized variables. So all of the details, so all of the timing, all of the word list, what they did. So you need to tell me what the experimental group did. And then you also need to tell me what the control group did. Now you can't say the control group did the same thing, but with these differences. You need to tell me everything, even if it seems like you're repeating a lot of information. Otherwise, your procedure is not clear. Now, if it helps you, what you can do is you can actually use subheadings down in here. So you could even make it to say participants were randomly allocated into an independent groups design, and then you could have a subheading for like control group and tell me what they did in the control group, and then have a subheading for experimental group if you wanted to, and tell me what they did there. If that makes it easier for you, you needn't do that, but if it helps you with your structure, I'm happy for you to do that. The last thing that you are doing is you are telling me how the information was collated. So down here in this experiment, we can see that we have the obviously independent groups design. We see what the control group's doing, what the experimental group's doing, and in this last dot point, we can see it says the number of errors were counted and used to determine the mean driving ability for each group. So what you would say is something like the word lists were counted up, they were compared, and we use this to calculate the mean number of words correctly recalled in a list of 20. So up in that experimental and the control group, we're talking about really the operationalized IV. Down here in this last dot point, we're including our operationalized DV. So remember, we have to be really detailed. We're going from how participants were allocated into the experimental group's design, what the experimental group and what the control group did explicitly, including timing, things like that, and then how we collated those results. The next section that we're looking at is ethics. Now, this is going to be a brief summary of any relevant risks and how these were managed, as well as the ethical guidelines that were followed in your investigation. Now, we didn't follow any of them, so we're going to make it up. What I would suggest you do is choose 2. Don't choose 3, just do 2. And choose 2 easy ones. I would not recommend that you use informed consent unless you're really confident in your wording. So remember, you're talking about the rights, risks, and procedures, and you're talking about the consent form. What I would suggest you do is use easy ones, like confidentiality, like voluntary participation. Other ones like informed consent, as I've already said, withdrawal rights, debriefing can be a little bit more tricky because it does have quite a few keywords that you need to include. So you may choose not to use them just in case you don't get those keywords. And of course, you would not be using deception because we didn't use it. So choose two easy ones that you're confident with. Define the ethic for me and then apply it to the investigation. So what I want you to do is, as well as define it, I want you to explain how we apparently follow this ethic, or this ethical procedure, I should say, within our experiment. So just make it up. So, for example, although we didn't debrief participants, you could say that we sent them an email outlining the results and the aims of our experiment, and then we had the counsellor speak to them. So just make up something that's plausible that we could have done to uphold two easy ethics. The next easy section is the results. Now, while this is easy, I often see people lose a lot of marks in this section because they're not including things like the titles of the axes. So within this section, you have two parts. You have your graphical representation of the data, and remember they are descriptive statistics, so things like our means, not our raw data. You are also going to summarize your information in words. So you're going to summarize your graph in words. So the first thing that you're going to do, obviously, is your graph. You are not using a table at all. So remember, it's not the raw data, it's descriptive stats like our means. So you must remember to label all of your axes and give an appropriate title. Now the title is going to be the same title as your holistic poster. So we're looking at the effect of the IV on the DV. Your x-axis is going to be your IV, and it's just going to be simplified. So we're looking at whether they use the context or state-dependent cues or not. And your y-axis is going to be your operationalized DV. So I want the mean number of words out of 20, as you can see here in this sample. Now the other thing I want you to remember is that we had a list of 20 words, not 11, not 12. So you need to make sure that your axis, the y-axis, is actually going up to 20, not 12. Now if you do that, I'm going to take marks off you, okay, because it's not how you should be drawing a graph. Obviously then you're just going to do a bar graph, and what it also might be helpful for you to do is just above each of your bars, just give me an indication of what the actual means were. The next thing that you're going to do after your graph is you are going to give a summary of the graph. What I want you to do is I want you to summarize, or I want you to start the summary with this statement here. The graph provided summarizes the descriptive statistics obtained in the study. So just make sure you chuck that in. And then all you need to do is you need to explain the trends of the study or the experiment or the graph. So you're just telling me which group did better. And you're making sure that you're giving the means as well. So here we can see it indicates that the control group who did not consume alcohol made on average 4 driving errors out of 16. In contrast, the average driving numbers in the experimental group who consumed alcohol was 14 out of 16. So you're giving me the trend who did better, and you're giving me the means, as we can see here. Now remember, they are going to be operationalized. So remember, operationalized DV always. The last thing I want to remind you is that the results should not be interpreted. You are literally just stating what you see in the graph. You are not giving any reason for why you think they may have occurred. Okay, so the discussion. This is the last big part of your post, and I actually think this is the biggest part and the one that's probably going to cause the most confusion in. So within this discussion, what you're doing is you are evaluating your data and relating it back to the cycle, the background theories and the past research. You're looking at sources of error, so EVs, CVs. You're looking at the overall limitations in terms of validity and reliability, and then you are giving a conclusion and a generalization. So you're doing 4 things. Now what that should be looking like is 4 paragraphs. So paragraph 1, paragraph 2, paragraph 3, and paragraph 4. So I'm going to go through each of these 4 paragraphs in a really detailed way. Now, before I jump into it, what I will say is this does kind of look pretty scary, but it's actually really similar to the conclusions that you guys have been doing. So it's really similar to the one that you made in the analysis task. So let's start with paragraph 1. So in paragraph 1, this is just an evaluation of your data, and it's going to be analysed in the context or in relation to our background theory and the past research. So the first thing that you're going to do here is you're going to give a statement or a summary of our research. So all you're doing is you're discussing the trend and you're including those means. So for example, all you'd say is the results of this study suggest that those who use context-dependent cues will have high recall, in brackets, you're putting in that operationalized DV or the means, as compared to those who do not use context-dependent cues when encoding and recalling information. Again, you're putting in those means. What I would do if I was you is I would literally just write that, let's not do that. I would literally just write that same statement that you wrote in the results here. Now, I know it doesn't seem very creative, but that's okay. I don't want you to be creative. I just want you to be right. So you've got your statement, your trend, and your operationalized DV, all that stuff. And then what you are going to do is you're going to relate our experiment, the trends, etc., to our past research and the background theory. So what you're doing is you're discussing the similarity or the difference between our results and those of the past research. So all you need to do is you need to say something like, our results were consistent with the results of who our experimenter was, because they both found X, Y, Z. So what you're doing is you're saying they're consistent or not, and then you were referring back to those results again. So they found the same results or they found different results. But make sure you're a little bit more explicit, okay? So you're talking about those context or state-dependent cues on memory retrieval. The third little part of this paragraph is you're saying that our experiment does or does not support our hypothesis. And so you are just going to then restate the hypothesis. Now, it doesn't have to be operationalized. So it can just be a simple research hypothesis. So all we're doing is we're saying our results, it is consistent with past research, these are the reasons why. It does or does not support our hypothesis. And remember, you don't have to operationalize that last hypothesis down there. So that's paragraph 1. Let's have a look at paragraph 2. Now this one's pretty easy. All we are looking at in our second paragraph is sources of errors, which is actually just our EVs or our CVs. Now, you guys definitely have really, really explicit notes on the EV that we had and the CV. Now, we've written that together, so I would just use that structure. Now, remember, you have to talk about 2. So you can talk about 1 EV and 1 CV. So you would start off by saying there are a number of limitations in this study, including, and start off with whatever the EV or the CV. So remember, when you're talking about each of the EVs or CVs, You are identifying the EV, so you're saying participant differences. You are describing the EV, so you're saying this is what they were, so maybe those in the experimental group had, on average, a higher memory ability than those in the control group. You're applying, so make sure you're talking about who was in the experimental, who was the control context or state-dependent cues, or the absence of those cues. And then you're telling me how it affects the results. So we would expect that if those in the experimental group had on average a higher memory ability, then they would have a higher number of a higher mean number of words correct to record in a list of 20 in comparison to those who had a lower memory ability. So just remember, with your EVs and CVs, again, you're using an operationalized DV. You're always operationalizing that DV. And you're saying that the results may have occurred. This is for the EV. So EV, oh crap. So EV, the results may have been affected by the memory ability rather than the context of state-dependent cues, so they may have had an effect. When you're talking about the CV, which I believe was the word list, we are saying that, so again, we are identifying in non-standardized testing and design. We're describing and applying, so we're saying that the experimental group, whoever they were, probably had an easier word list as compared to those in the control group who had a really hard word list. This would mean that they would have a high recall of mean words correct to recall in a list of 20 because of whatever, okay? So we're saying EV may have had the effect. The CV has had an effect. So in that two paragraphs, so in that paragraph 2, second paragraph I should say, we are outlining the EV and the CV, and we're talking about how we could prevent it in the future. Now, it's not enough to just say, for example, that we would use an alternate design like a repeated measures design. You need to tell me what that is and why it's actually going to fix the problem. So if you're telling me about a repeated measures design or matched participants, why does it eliminate or minimize participant differences? If we're using a similar word list of the same difficulty, why is it eliminating that CV? So the way you would structure this is talk about the EV or whatever, and then how you would fix it, then talk about the CV and how to fix it. Make sure that's really good, that's really explicit. So the third paragraph is when you would talk about the limitations holistically. So you would talk about your validity and your reliability. So in paragraph 3, you need to talk about both validity and reliability, and the fact that in both of our experiments, they were low. So let's start with talking about that validity. So the first thing that you would do is you would identify that this study showed low validity due to the presence of a CV. Now, you can talk about EVs, but because we did have a CV, this means that we know that the IV did not actually have an effect on the DV. What's actually happened is this other variable, this unwanted variable, i.e. the word list, has had a systematic unwanted effect on the DV. So effectively, the word lists were the thing that affected recall rather than the CDCs or SDCs. So the word lists are actually a new IV. So that means our whole experiment is pretty much screwed. So while it might be okay to talk about EVs, it's probably going to waste too many words when you can just talk about the CV and get a much clearer picture of the fact that we have low validity. So you need to state that there's a CV, and I would just very, very, very briefly outline what the CV was so I can say, or you can say that you've applied it. And then you need to make sure that you're saying that this means that the IV did not have an effect on the DV. Okay, so for our validity, IV did not affect DV. Okay, so you're saying low validity because there's a CV. The CV was this. It means the IV did not affect the DV. And that's as simple as you need to say. You don't need to go into any more detail than that. The second thing that you're going to talk about is the fact that we had low reliability. Now, what you're going to do is you're going to state that this is because there was only one trial of the experiment, and this means that we are unsure if there's consistency between the results across the different situations. And that's exactly how you say it. And I'll say it again really slowly. So there was low reliability. This was because there was only one trial of the experiment. This means that we are unsure if there is consistency between the results across different experimental situations. So that is your third paragraph. Your last paragraph is your conclusions and your generalizations. Now this paragraph for us is really easy because although our results suggested that the IV didn't have an effect on the DV, we know that we had a CV for both experiments, and so it actually makes our job much easier. So what we're doing is we are bringing all of it back to the IV and the DV, but what we're talking about is how we might make a conclusion in future if we fixed all the issues. So we need to talk about if a conclusion could be made really validly, and if we can actually generalize to the population. So you have the structure here. So we're just starting off by saying, due to such limitations, it's difficult to determine whether the IV caused a change in the DV. Now remembering what you're doing is you're applying. So then what you're going to do is you're saying in the future, XYZ needs to be fixed. Now this is going to be very brief. So you just name the CV, name the fact that we didn't have any reliability or there was no consistency because we only did one trial. It needs to be fixed to allow more accurate results in order to get a better conclusion. Then what you would do is you would evaluate whether you need to make a generalization. So we're just saying something like, in our experiment, no generalizations can be made due to the fact that the sample was not representative of the population as a convenience sample was used. So what you need to say is, or what you need to do, I should say, is you need to say we can't generalize. The sample was not representative of the population. A convenient sampling was used, and that's why. And so that is your discussion. So the last little bit that we need to talk about is the appendix and the references. I've already spoken about the appendices, but don't forget them, they're really important. Remember, you're going to have three. You're going to have A, word list 1, B, word list 2, and C is going to be your raw data. Now remember, you need to make sure that you are referencing them in the procedure. Now that's going to be for your raw data and the materials section for your word lists. Now again, remember you need to attach those at the back of your poster, and so they need to be labelled Appendix A, word list 1, etc., and just chuck them or staple them in a plastic pocket on the back. The next thing, and I guess the last thing you need to be doing, is putting in the references for your section. Now this is how you would reference everything, and you are going to have two references. You're going to reference where you got your definitions, and you're also going to reference where you got your past research. Now the good news is that you actually got both of these things here, your definitions and your past research, from the same textbook. So you actually just got it from a textbook that you guys use, which is Grievous, 2017. So you actually only need to put in one reference, but make sure you're doing it properly. So I would access your textbook to find the author, the year, the title, edition, place of publishing, and the publisher. So make sure that is properly done. Also, don't forget you need to be using in-text referencing. So in the so after each definition, you're just putting Grievous 217 to in-text reference, and you need to make sure you're referencing the researcher and the year that they did the research in your past research section. So in the introduction, that's when that in-text referencing needs to occur. Now, lastly, there's a lot of stuff that you have to do, but you have to do it with a word limit. Now, the word limit is 1,000 words. Now, I'm going to be honest, I'm not going to be too picky about this. Essentially, if you can fit it on that sheet, then I am going to be okay with it, as long as the font is not like a size 8. What I would suggest is that if it's like size 12, then that's going to be okay, but it cannot be smaller than a size 12 font. It also cannot be larger than a size 18 font to bulk it out. Now, you're going to have more than enough stuff to talk about, so you might need to manipulate that template I give you just to fit everything in properly. But remember, it should stay in that template, so I don't want the sections moved about, but you can make them bigger or smaller. So remember, include the title, include the appropriate subheadings and things like that. Make sure the paragraphs that need to flow, and make sure the ones that can use dot points use dot points. So everything needs to flow. The only ones that you can use dot points for are your materials. Actually, I'm going to scratch that. Don't even use it for your materials. The only one you can use dot points for is for your procedure. And the only thing I want to see subheadings for is your participants, your materials, and your procedure. Everything else has to flow. Remember, you are using formal language. You must write in third person and in past tense. So make sure you're really paying attention to the detail of your language. I would suggest 2 things to you. First, after you've drafted your poster, use the rubric at the back of your EPI booklet to make sure you've done everything as it should be. Now, that rubric that we've given you at the back of the EPI booklet is what I will be using to mark this poster. So it's a really good checklist to use. The second thing is read your poster out loud after taking a break and make note of when it sounds a bit weird or funny, or get somebody else to proof it for you who actually doesn't do psychology, like a friend or like your parents or whatever, and get them to point out the mistakes so it sounds like your post is making sense, it is using appropriate language and things like that. Now remember, this is worth 30 marks. This is 50% of that total EPI. So please make sure that you are spending a fair amount of time drafting it over, the holidays. When you come in on the Tuesday or the Wednesday, have questions ready to go, and I will answer them in class. And then on that Thursday or the Friday, remember, I want the EPI booklet completely filled in. That's going to go towards your marks, so that has to be handed in. Your poster printed, I want it A3 or in a pinch A4. I want your appendices, and that's all I want. But remember, it has to be printed. I will send you the template, the sample, this PowerPoint, your past research, and another copy, an electronic copy that is, of the EPI booklet for you, so you can get this all done. Now, you have about a week left of holidays, so make sure you're doing all of your holiday homework for me. And if you have any questions, you can shoot me an email. and I will see you very, very soon.